Good evening, comrades. Thanks for joining us for another session of Why Marx. We're still looking at the Soviet Union, the second of three sessions that we're devoting to that important subject that, we on the left really have to get right. It is still a huge subject for the left, and we need answers to it. Tonight, a really interesting aspect of it, the mere existence of the USSR as a sort of red thread led to the ruling class making a number of concessions to the working class, particularly after World War II. Keynesianism, I'm sure we're looking at that tonight, you could argue was very much of that time an attempt to stop the working class from emulating what's going on in the East. And, we could discuss later perhaps if you can actually revive Keynesianism. That certainly was the case in West Germany, where I'm from, which experienced boom years after losing the war because capitalism made a conscious choice to invest into Germany, because East Germany was right next door, etc. So we're very pleased tonight to have with us Peter Kennedy, who's looking specifically at the question of the role of Stalinism within the left in establishing social democratic reforms and class containment in Britain after World War II. So thank you very much, comrade. Thanks for joining us. Peter will be speaking for about 40 minutes, I'm guessing, and then we're opening up for question and comments from the floor. Over to you, comrade.
Okie doke. Thanks for attending. I'm going to look at the role of Stalinism within the left in establishing social democratic reform and class containment in Britain post-45. So the focus is on the 20s and 30s within a broad context. There's been many studies, a lot of research on this. My motivation for considering the area is to reveal what it says about transition, the idea of capitalist and decline, capitalist decline, transition within the capitalist mode of production, and in transition but not transformation, which into a non-capitalist form of production. So the conditions in the 20s and 30s were amenable for this kind of transition, and the capitalist class were unsure about the prospects of state intervention using planning to manage the law of value, should we say, value relations. And it took a bit of time for that kind of like confidence to gel. And the role of what I call the left labour establishment, of the leaders of the trade unions, TUC, labour leadership, and a groundswell of the left intelligentsia. Once they could be seen to be useful to those forces within capitalism that required some sort of electric shock treatment of the system to regenerate growth, could look in confidence at the labour left establishment in perhaps controlling the working class in that growth. That's what interests me. So let's I'll just run through the argument, and it's a kind of argument, like most of what I'm interested in is like looking at the patterns of the wood rather than concentrating on the trees, maybe like the finer detail. So just to recap, for those things we already know, 1920s and 30s were a time of political and economic doldrums. In other words, capitalism was in a state of depression. There'd been a world war prior to that. British productive capital had been retarded for some years. Old industries hadn't been renewed, refurbished with new technology that kept up with the USA and Germany and so on. And after the war in the 20s, the economy was kind of suffered the consequences of that. So there was a kind of era of transition prevailed, and new industries had yet to flourish. This is signified by the turnover of governments at the time, leading to a national government in 1931, which lasted for 4 to 5 years before the Baldwin Conservative governments gearing up for war took over. So the instability was both political and economic, and what was firing this was the confrontation between working class, who were more combative, the promise of a society fit for all the heroes coming over for war was just kind of rhetoric, and the economy didn't boom, didn't supply the housing that they promised, and the kind of emergent healthcare reforms and the national insurance reforms, partial though they were, didn't materialise into a kind of universal system or anything like that. So the workers were highly combative. It was a time in the 20s, especially of the syndicalist heyday, and they were kind of like key, along with other groups, in propagating struggle, class conflict at the level of production. And tied into that and overlapping that was the obvious fact that the Bolsheviks had seized power and shut off parts of the world to capital. And that kind of gave an inspiration across Europe, and including Britain, which always had like a kind of complex relationship with both the Bolshevik Revolution and Stalinism later on in the 30s. So you had this kind of combative working class confronting a finance capitalist faction which remained hegemonic. It remained hegemonic in the sense that very reluctant to think anything more seriously about productive investments and a kind of transition towards a new regime of accumulation, and sought to maintain distance from the working class. And this was aided and abetted by government policy. As you know, the government in 1925 returned back onto the gold standard, which placed sterling as at a high value, which made that export very costly, and that led to a downturn in production, along with tightening of budgets, balanced budgets, and high interest rates. And all these things, balanced budgets, high interest rates, and the gold standard, were there to kind of like placate finance capitalism and the notion that a failing imperial British power could still maintain its financial hegemony across the world and act as the major currency for investment in financial instruments, but this was at the expense of the economy. So anyway, what we're getting at here is a system which was in stagnation, with obvious effects of long-term unemployment, which signified stagnation. So just moving on, we can see, don't take fright, going back to the Marx's central concept of the commodity form, which he opened capital with. Commodity form is the cellular form of capital. And if you like, as I see it, the development of capitalism had an effect on the commodity form, and so capital, which led to the kind of depression. And so in the 19th century to the 20th century, capitalist system, or the mode of production of capital, had gone through a series like cycles of crisis and recovery, and so on. And each time they became more severe, less cyclical over the 10-year period, more structural, and so on. And on each occasion, they had an effect on the commodity form. And don't forget, the commodity form is a contradictory attraction of two very different things. Useful products for people's needs, to meet people's needs, out with any notion of like profitability. But that was tied to, under the commodity form, that those use values would only get produced if they become exchange value for value, surplus value, so profit. So this is the contradiction, and the argument, and the schema here is trying to say that over time, the commodity form is ruptured somewhat, so that within the more severe crisis, then there's a crisis of the reproduction of the commodity form, and that leads to depression. It leads to the kind of politicization of use value and social need when capitalism isn't accumulating and kind of finds it difficult to swing into a recovery. And so it poses the question on how does capitalism move to a situation, a regime that can accommodate the bringing together again of exchange and use value in terms favorable to capital. And with the development of the working class, what that leads to as well is a kind of acceptance that some use values may have to be provided and policed outside of value relations itself over time. So I suppose this kind of schematic thing has been written on, mapped onto real world events as I see them. And in a way, the 20s and 30s represent this kind of like structural epochal crises and the partial recoveries, which in some way fractured commodity form and led to the capitalist class asking questions of themselves about what is to be done at this time. How can we bring things together while controlling the working class was one issue. How do we perhaps begin to plan and administer capital itself, and what implications that has for the state's role in planning, administering and managing and policing the production of use values and regulating distribution of value through taxes to fuel those use values. And they were the kind of off-putting things for capital. And if you look at, I'm not going to go into detail on it, but liberal yellow books which talked about seizing the day and transform the economy based on more productive activity, more state intervention was kind of echoing, though they wouldn't use this schematic formula of Marxism, they were kind of echoing those kind of sentiments about what is required. And one thing to be sure of is that to contain finance capital. And the same with Labour, they were groping around, and also the Tories. So I'll just leave that there. We can come back to it if you like. And after the World Economic Conference of 1932, which the US dominates as the kind of transitional new hegemonic power, imperial power, taking over from Britain. That conference recommitted the world economy, the major powers to the gold standard and balanced budgets and free trade. And Harold Macmillan, who was one of those old Tories that were inclined to believe that we need more than that. We need to kind of forget that kind of system and move on. Lamented the conference failures in the following terms. While there remains a lingering hope that everything will come right of its own accord, the reply must be made to those who dream of a return to the old days and rebel against any suggestion of organisation, of control, is simply that the world has changed, that such a return is technically, politically and economically impossible. And despite his kind of pessimism, but drawing attention to the kind of perhaps implicitly what was needed, nevertheless, despite the pessimism, a power block between capital and Labour was in the offing. And Keynes kind of signifies this as well as the Macmillan. So with Keynes, he could posit, looking into the near future, that a new conception was in the air called planning. But whether it's going to prove possible to carry out planning in actual practice without a great change in the traditions and in the machinery of democratic government, the old stuff, liberal, laissez-faire, that is the big question mark. What we do know is that the current failure of unplanned regimes in the West does establish a prima facie case for state planning. And Macmillan follows this. When the history of the present period comes to be written, it will be seen as a hiatus between the old economic system and the new. It's a period within which, which cannot yet be dignified by the name transition. But to visualize the transition, it's necessary to see more or less clearly both the beginning and the end of the process. And I think in class terms, if I was in, I would be worried about that end process leading to the radicalization of the working class. And perhaps that's what he meant. The history of the events has made us familiar with the framework of the system, which we're leaving behind. Unfortunately, there's no such clarity about the destination. The great need of the moment is for a new theory of socio-economic organisation, which will facilitate the evolution towards a new economic system suitable to change the circumstances of the modern world. So in the kind of language used by the bourgeoisie, what's inferred is that the capitalists need to think about transitioning from the old form, which led to war, imperialism dictated by finance capital, towards something more consolidated at the national level, more based on productive capital, more in line with formal securing an agreement across class, and that were the dangers that they faced. So Macmillan and his capitalist allies didn't know where such a transition would end up. It could lead to capitalist growth and containing the working class. Didn't know how this kind of proto-administrative plan of capitalism might come about. Clearly, the capitalist class would have to secure a pact with the labour establishment, which is defined below there. The reason being is that the labour establishment could play a part. If we look at the Labour Party, without the Labour Party, the working class would be, in my opinion, throughout the centuries of the 20th century, perhaps a lot more radical than it was. So the labour establishment would play a vital part to contain the working class within any new settlement. And one suggestion that's up for grabs tonight is that Stalinism was one vital source of such a pact, perhaps the essential source, the essential glue between the classes, acting as a bridge. Kind of accident meets necessity. And when we say Stalinism, nothing's implied about the CPGB and members of the CPGB, or even the leaders, completely agreeing with Joe Stalin in Russia about how to handle the working class and the capitalist class in Britain. Didn't say anything about that. We're looking at Stalinism as a kind of aura an epochal presence. For some, it cast a long shadow. For others, it cast a shining light on the possible securing of class compromise. Briggs and Saville suggest the source of Stalinism's influence on capital reformers and the left establishment. So the growing up political sympathy between the Soviet Union was one of the most striking characteristics of the British labour movement in the 30s. The coincidence in time between the beginnings of the world economic crisis at the end of the 20s and the launch of the first 5-year plan that brought about a much deeper interest in contemporary Russia. Russia's industrialization apparently offered the sharpest contrast to the collapse of output and the rapid rise in unemployment levels in the capitalist world. It was not in any way extraordinary that larger numbers of working people and intellectuals should begin to look upon Soviet Russia with a new understanding and appreciation, and might be over-egging the pudding here. But we should also realise that even Macmillan was kind of like in awe of the rapid industrial growth within the Soviet Union. And I suppose he was also in awe of the fact that they could contain the working class. There was order there. So I don't think he was particularly bothered about the lack of democracy. But this idea of planning had caught the attention. And I suppose that was the attraction, what form it might take. There's clearly no intention of it taking anything like a socialist form, or even replicating the kind of Stalinist administration called planning itself. But what was required, ideally, for the capitalist class was undemocratic administrative planning, but based on the capitalist mode of production. So Briggs and Saville kind of point to this, confluence of interests, fascination, if you like. And arguably, what people were groping with is the kind of three possibilities that Stalinism, if you didn't look into the USSR and its mode of production too hard, offered to the labour establishment. And it's as follows. So first was the Soviet Union's rejection of the market as a mechanism of control over labour and regulator of production in favour of a state administrative plan, more intervention of state. So on the one hand, the labour establishment could point to the Soviet Union as a material evidence of the success of the conception of socialist, inverted scare quote brackets, for renewed industrial growth. On the other hand, the capitalist class began to see in the labour establishment a potential ally in the establishment of non-market elements of status controls over the labour movement, if they were to consider state intervention to save capitalism. So they saw the kind of attractions there. Second was the Soviet Union's linking of socialism in one country to class and nation. And at the time, there was a general shift away from internationalism towards nationalism and framing political, economic problems and solutions within the national framework and producing cross-class alliances on the basis of nationalism. And so this idea of socialism in one country seemed attractive. Both of these links reinforced in the eyes of the labour establishment, at least, the viability of their own general politics of class compromise and class containment within the national form. And that's been the kind of gravitas of the Labour Party since its inception. Class containment, cross-class compromise within a chauvinistic national framework. Third, and contrary to the Soviet Union, the labour establishment did not require direct repression to control the working class of Britain. So that kind of bureaucratic, authoritarian rule in the Soviet Union, which Jack discussed last week, was not required in the case, we have to take that core of planning. The discipline imposed by the labour movement on the labour movement by an alien Marxist would prove to be adequate to the task. So it's like taking the seeds of some of Stalinism, especially this idea of state administration, control of the working class, but also maintaining regulated markets, the regulation of value relations of commodity form in ways that kind of could be used to control the working class, along with status forms of control over the working class. And the machinations of that, the particular ways and the policies that were pursued to kind of marry those state controls and market controls, still had to be thrashed out. But that was kind of like, three possibilities offered in general by the long shadow of Stalinism over the West in decline at this period of time. And there's no use ignoring the real differences within the labour establishment, and especially over the nature of the plan, whether it was going to be what the balance was going to be in terms of plan and markets, and these were reflected in the different divisions within the Labour Party. And if you look at, the mainstay of the established Labour Party, the Parliamentary Labour Party, leaders of the TUC, Gateskill was part of Labour leadership, Durban, and Bevan, Sister, and so on. So these kind of like endorsed the view that planning and the markets should complement each other in some way. While those in the Labour establishment on most of the left would kind of think the opposite way, that the markets shouldn't be totally obliterated, abolished, but should be kind of suppressed for a more direct state intervention in production and the management of production and the administration of capital and so on, and labour. So that was the kind of, there was no like, I wouldn't say there was no qualitative difference, but there was a difference that needs to be hammered out to form a unity. But there was a kind of overarching sense of unity, which is underscored by the cross-fertilization of ideas in a number of think tanks that were set up in the 20s, particularly the Society for Socialist Inquiry and Propaganda and the New Fabian Research Bureau. That was a space, intellectual space, where these arguments could be hammered out. And more importantly, there were Keynesian fiscal policy, which is the planning through money, through monetary means, through budget, through the power of money, how that could be established and set up within policy and work along more direct interventions of the state, maybe through nationalisation of taking things out of the market and so on, whether that's in the welfare state or in various core industries which are important to the British economy. So difference there, sources of unity. Probably the real difference was with the capitalist elite. So the issue that threatened to jeopardise the aim of the Labour establishment to become part of a new power bloc with or alongside the capitalist elite was, for one thing, the language of Marxism that was kind of like core to talk of socialism, British road to socialism, the even the corrupted form of Stalinist understandings of Marxism and its categories. And these informed the left, who were influential, CPGB, within the Labour establishment. And that was kind of something that needed to be challenged. Otherwise, it would scare the capitalist class off, and anathema to the capitalist class. And indeed, the CPGB, which had led the Popular Front in the 30s, preaching peaceful coexistence and the like, and projecting socialism in one country, reinforced alliances with the trade union bureaucracy, the Labour Party, which and the language they use kind of represented this kind of roadblock. That's the argument. But as the 30s, and this is kind of again the Wood and the Trio thing, as the 30s progressed, and if you see the development of capitalism economically and politically as a dialectic of accident and necessity, then both combined with the arrival of the Stalin-Hitler Pact, as we know, and this provided the context for the left to break with Popular Front bonds and the ideological verbiage of Stalinized Marxism. And this kind of opened the way to a consensus between the left establishment and the capitalist class to reconstruct the political economy of what eventually would become social democracy and as part of an era of social democracy. Yeah, so this is just a fair note. Jenkins argued that the Tribune left in separating themselves from the Kremlin turn had ironically smoothed the path of Morrison and Attlee, which were those that were kind of like more averse to the radical sentiments of the CPGB, and those on the left who were perhaps more genuine about a kind of socialist, top-down socialist transition. And henceforth, the dominant trend within the Labour left establishment was the right of Labour, which was averse to Marxism and more pro-market in the management of the transitional leitmotif of what sometimes is called the law of value and law of planning, the transition there. But it's probably best to see it as how is Labour exploited? Well, is it to be value? Is it to be through planning and the state? Is it to be a mixture of both, in which case we have to manage the two? And that's probably how to look at social democracy. How to pump surplus out of the direct producers in the surplus value, or directly through the state, which is largely non-value creating but equally exploitative to workers. So the main thing is that the way had been cleared for the Labour establishment to take its place within the new power bloc and to revive the social democratic programme of the working class containment as a basis for capitalist accumulation. So the seeds were there, had been set, a bloc had been established, and obviously we haven't said anything about the international scene, but what kind of consolidated the bloc were things like the wider context of the establishment of the Bretton Woods system, which pegged international currencies to the dollar, which itself was pegged to the gold standard at a distance, which allowed flexibility for nations to repeg the value of their currencies whenever that was required to adjust themselves either to the balance of class forces, the development of trade, how productive they were, and so on. And so it allowed a kind of space for national programs, national economic programs to contain the working class within different countries. And on top of that, the mapping of the Cold War, which divided things more fundamentally between the West, the capitalist West, as it came to be seen in this kind of transition, where a large part of the world had been taken out of value production. If we take the view that Russia and its later satellites didn't produce value, was not a capitalist, state capitalist society, and so on. If we do, then we have to debate that out and probably rethink what's just been said. So there we have it for that. And what we end up with is a kind of like the broader class containment, the possibilities of containment, which eventually led to a kind of like post-war reconstruction based on the things we well know: the welfare state, universal benefit system for the unemployed, which broke the link in a way between the survival of working class people and the necessity to produce value for capital. That is, you can be unemployed and not productive for capital, but still get a universal benefit, which give you some sort of like space between that exploitation. And taking housing, health, education out with capitalist production as commodities. The introduction of tripartite industrial relations systems, which attempted to manage value by managing prices, profits, and incomes, and the nationalisation of the major industries, all the things that we well know that lasted for a period of time before they all began to become deconstructed again as capital pulled away from the deal, as not least because of all of these things over time, over the period of the 50s and 60s, led to politicization of the working class for one thing, but also began to affect the profitability of capital. And they sought a new kind of compact, which was called neoliberalism in the end. But it created a system whereby Macmillan could, sigh a bit of relief and tell us that us lot have never had it so good. Underpinning that is the management of money, the partial decommodification of labour, and the management of the labour process. So the management of money, which is important in fiscal planning, restricted the movement of capital and the conversion of the pound, redistributed capital from capitalist to worker, regulated production and consumption in the process, because workers with more money are more likely to consume than capitalists who save it and invest and generate more surplus value or just leave it idle. And it normalized deficit spending and directed capital to social need provision. And the partial decommodification of labour, which underpinned social democracy, manifested in things like the establishment of what effectively was a social wage, very poor one, Social Insurance Act, but it was a universal one, and the independence of the sale of labour power. So was broken with capital. Industrial relations systems which were able to bargain in ways that didn't always meet the needs of capital's profitability and sought to generate wages above value and sought to manage the rate of exploitation and the kind of way that labour, that the working class were exploited within the labour process. And that was inflected by, social objectives all the time to create a life outside of work for the working class. And the last thing was the management of the labour process. In Britain, there was nothing like scientific management. It was played around with in the 20s. There was paternalist kind of management. There was kind of amateurishness, which led to kind of poor productivity, led to unrest. The kind of Taylorist scientific management of the rationalisation of production, which is typical of like the Fordist production line in the US, was not embedded in the British labour process, but slowly but surely they began to institutionalise those groups that could kind of like focus on creating a more administered labour process to integrate scientific management, create internal labour markets, make it difficult to hire and fire labour in the external labour market, provide unions and managements with the power to control the administration of demarcation of jobs. So you can't just ask workers to work any old way, all sorts of flexible working practices, and any day or night, and without bonus and all the rest, all that went to the wall and came back again, obviously, in later years. So they were the three pillars underpinning social democracy. I'm not saying they worked very well, but they did cause problem for the social democratic era, and it produced class conflict. The wildcat strikes in the 60s, the longer, more enduring strikes in the 70s, which we all well know, led to 3-day weeks and all the rest of it, and eventually the pulling of the plug on this class compromise. So I'll leave it at that, and obviously the arguments about the role of Stalinism is kind of core to this, but let's see what happens in the discussion. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Comrade. Are you able to switch off the share screen? There we are. Well done. Thank you very much, Comrade. If anybody's got any questions or comments, please click raise hand and we can bring you in. I've got a couple of questions for you, Peter. And that'd be maybe you can ask them first, and then we bring some comrades in from the floor. So this idea, you save capitalism by basically bringing the working class on board, bringing labor on board, class compromise as well, class collaboration, etc. You explained it, as Stalinism. I'm not sure I agree with calling that Stalinism, because you say it didn't mean, you don't mean that it mean that means you have to, agree with Stalin, or you have to be a Stalinist or whatever. Perhaps a better way to say it for me would be just to say this is the existence of the Soviet Union as a counterweight. And this is not something you touched on much, but what role do you think the existence of the Soviet Union as an alternative political system that seemed to work, that seemed to do it slightly better, perhaps in some respects, not in terms of democracy, etc., but it was an alternative to a declining capital, as you described, but that was kind of falling apart. You had obviously working class unrest in the West, etc. And to stop the working class also copying what was happening in the Soviet Union. What role did the mere existence of the Soviet Union play in terms of leading to this attempt to buy off the working class with Keynesianism, etc. And then related, it's a slightly looking into the future though, is the question of the possible revival of Keynesianism, the possible revival of such a policy without the existence of the Soviet Union. Corbynism, that's all Corbynism was about, isn't it? That's the sort of Ken Loach film. This is what the Green New Deal is all about. Is it even possible in your estimation that today, when the working class is at its lowest, perhaps in terms of strike action, in terms of a political alternative, and there is no Soviet Union where people could go or which could act as a red thread, etc. Is under today's circumstances, is Keynesianism even possible in terms of would the establishment even, is there any reason why the establishment would go for it? Is that something that you think is worth arguing for, or should we not actually say for what we actually need, which is, of course, the overthrow of the capitalist system, rather than appealing to a bit more money and a bit more democracy, a bit more power? I wonder if you could comment on that, and then I'll bring in comrades from the floor.
Yeah, good questions then. Yeah, I didn't think capitalism. Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that Stalinism was like directly implicit and the only game in town to was a kind of force of collaboration between the classes. What it did say is that kind of aura of Stalinism, the fact that it was in existence, and what it appeared to represent in Russia, the Soviet Union, what was going on there, added a bit of grist to the mill for those labor reformers to point to in an era of depression. That, and as far as I can see, it was what they could point to is that, and they always had an eye to the capitalist class, and because they wanted to reform capitalism, so you didn't want to abolish the capitalist class. So what you do with it? Well, you join them, but you create some sort of basis of compromise. And the suggestion that there was planning, administration in the Soviet Union that looked quite rational from the outside, if you didn't look too hard, and they didn't. Then that was the case. But in the 20s, there was a slightly different matter. There was a Bolshevism there, and that was kind of like a revolution. And for at least a couple of years within the early 20s, it wasn't Stalinism. It was kind of a revolution, and the thought was that workers can take power. And then so the labor establishment were more hostile to Bolshevism. And I think that, like, well, we had World War One and the end of World War One, we didn't get social democracy because of Bolshevism, really. And at the end of the lead up to World War Two and the end of World War Two, Stalinism was there. The forces of reform were a lot stronger, and so we got social democracy. And so it's not war itself. So people have often said, well, it was the war economy, the planned administration. That was the decidement. It wasn't. It's politics. It's how you can contain the working class if you want to stay within capitalism in its reform state. But it's like going back to the commodity form, and we always forget that there's a use value there being subordinated, and that's got to pop up now and again and become politicized as capitalism develops. But we forget that a lot in Marxism, and we shouldn't, because the development of capitalism has got to kind of make it more difficult for value relations to subordinate use values, the useful things that people make. And the other side is that value relations cause profit rate falls, cause a lack of effective demand in bourgeois terms, in other words, under consumptionism and all the rest of it, crisis problems. So not only does it cause crisis problems and depression, it prevents the production of use values. And that's going to get a reaction from largely the working class who will want to continue receiving those use values, because really at base, that's the reason why they survive and why their wages buy use values. But they're not there to invest in capital again and make more value. So went on a bit there, sorry about that. Yeah, the possible revival of social democracy, and I would you never write anything off. So social democracy could come about again, but I don't think I think it might be very difficult for social democracy to come back in again in full, and in the West. It's certainly the case that you could say that Keynesianism is kind of being experimented with in China at the moment quite well. The kind of the architecture of like state planning, using money, using the banks. And don't forget, Keynes wanted euthanasia for the financial system and for the state to take control of that. So I suppose in a way, China are using that to develop in hothouse fashion the means of production and encourage like capitalist investment from the West and indigenously more. So you get this kind of like Keynesianism working its way out there. But I think in this country, even though you have Corbynism, Corbynism was kind of, if you look at Corbyn programme, look at the programme in 1945, Attlee government, and Attlee was like a lot more right-wing than Corbyn. And the Corbyn programme going into the 2019 election was paled in the significance of the kind of programme that you're getting then. And that's because the conditions have changed. And it's about like trying to get capital to constrain finance capital, to decrease the mobility of capital, decrease power of finance capital, and to direct capital back into production again. But the problem with that is a falling rate of profit, crisis tendencies, overproduction. And if that was the case in the 20s and 30s, and just before the World War, which led to war, it's certainly the case today. And anyway, if you've done that, you'll do what China's doing now. They're working towards like an integration, a streaming of AI into the production process, and that has got to take away jobs, and that has got to affect things like the organic composition of capital. In other words, an increasing constant dead capital and a relatively less development or increase in living labour power, the source of value. So you're into problems there. And then we have the fact that what they learned, the capitalist class in social democracy, that era, was that Labour become really politicised, you know, economically, but also politically. So, you know, so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, an interesting one about China is, of course, that they're not trying to buy off the working class, clearly, you know, sort of with the extension of trade union rights that we've seen after 1945. I mean, none of that is happening in China, or a welfare state, all of that. You know, there's certainly experimentation with planning to one degree or another, but in terms of, you know, the advantages that the working class had from Keynesianism, that certainly isn't the case in China now. How do
Well,
you see? Sorry,
yeah,
the generated.
just on that point, if you look at what China's doing now, then it's after 2015 and the investment, the bursting of the bubble in the property sector, then there was a slight reorientation, and they are like trying to like use capital and distribute it to the poorest elements of the population to raise their living standards, and using some of the you know, some of that kind of money from capital to do that. So there's redistribution there, but you know, to take your point, a lot of it is direct planning rather than like fiscal planning in that way. But there is fiscal planning there.
Where do you see the relationship between the rolling back of the welfare state in, you know, Western social democracies, etc., and the end of the Soviet Union?
I don't think the welfare state hasn't been rolled back. It's just been reinterpreted. You know, state intervention is just as like evident today, but it takes a different form. You know, under social democracy, it took the form of a more direct form of involvement of trade unions and, you know, a tripartite system, attempt to develop universal provision of benefits and so on. But if you look right now, the state's intervening, but it's in the form of like deregulating public sector services to smaller businesses which are under the control and direction and regulation of the state. In other words, to atomize the kind of like state intervention that went on in more direct ways under social democracy. Because it's those direct ways that tend to facilitate more easily class struggle, you know, working class struggle. Because when you deregulate and privatize services, you start to provide them, but you provide them in a way where workers are less powerful, you know, where maybe trade unions are not recognized or they're less powerful and so on. So I forget the other side of what you said there.
Thank you. Got three people now from the floor. If anybody else would like to speak or ask a question, please click raise hand. So first Paul, then Raphael, and then Matthew.
Yeah, I think we need to contrast the interest in the Soviet Union in the 1930s with what happened afterwards. I mean, I argue this in my book, The New Civilization. You had the slump in 1929, and production fell by a third in the capitalist world, industrial production, which is massive. In the Soviet Union, on the other hand, you had the first 5-year plan in that year, the final version of it. And the figures that were provided were incredible because of the upsurge in production. Now, some people at the time realized this was not terribly relevant to Western countries because this was an industrial revolution that Britain had had a century before and Germany half a century before and so forth. But the broad feeling was, and this wasn't, Peter makes this out with Macmillan, but The Spectator, which was a sort of a moderate Tory journal in those days, The Economist, and other journals like that, liberal journals, were saying, what are they doing out there in the Soviet Union that we're not doing here? That's the important thing. They just contrasted slump in the West and booming industries in the Soviet Union. Now, this was pretty much broad swathe of thinking, not just the left, the pro-Soviet left, but also the social democratic sort of moderates like Attlee, Morrison, Dalton, and so forth, liberals, the pro planning wing of the Tories, Macmillan, Boothby, but it was combined with a full rejection of Soviet politics. So they looked at the purges later on, or the earlier trials, they looked at the repression and so forth. They said, no, that's not us. What dissociation from that completely. Now, what happened with the, Peter mentioned the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939. Not so much that, but the attack on Finland at the end of November really threw politics, against the Soviet Union. And you had there the first flash of the anti-communist consensus, an anti-communist popular front, one might say, which took off fairly shortly after the Second World War finished. And there you saw right-wing social democracy, liberalism, conservatism in a very strong anti-Soviet, anti-communist frame of mind. Now, this went, of course, in June 1941, and until shortly after the Second World War, it was, as one person put it, almost tantamount to treason to criticize the Soviet Union. But again, the Cold War came back with a vengeance. And whereas in the 30s, people were looking to the Soviet Union and saying, what are they doing there that we're not doing here? We need to have state intervention. Then, after the war, it was, yes, we need state intervention, but it was contrasted to the Soviet Union. That's a totalitarian system. That sort of consensus around the idea of the Soviet Union being totalitarian, therefore nothing to do with us, therefore a threat to us all classes in the West, which had that first flash in November 1939, that come back in a vengeance, 46, 47. And what you had was an emphasis on the undemocratic aspects of Stalinism and a rejection of their form of state intervention and a promotion of a capitalist form of state intervention, of the what was called in Britain Butskillism, which was after Butler and after Gateskill, the Tory economics buff, and Gateskill, the Labour leader of the late 50s. And therefore, Stalinism was seen as the sort of universal enemy of social democracy and conservatism and of liberalism. Now, the question of was raised by Tina and answered by Peter on the possibilities of a Keynesian revival after the demise of the Soviet Union. Now, this is interesting. Was it just a coincidence that the sort of hardline anti-welfare state form of capitalism really took off as the Soviet Union sort of collapsed and died in the mid-1980s and so forth? Was it purely a coincidence, or was there some kind of causal connection? That's something I think would be worth looking at. Was the Keynesian peacetime Keynesianism, as opposed to wartime Keynesianism of the Second World War, was that a need to contain the working class, which was certainly was militant, but never really posed a threat to the system? Or was it a question of reviving the capitalist economy on the grounds that traditional sort of private enterprise, night watchman state and that sort of thing couldn't actually do it? And that, of course, raises the question of why Keynesianism was dropped. Was the Soviet Union seen as some sort of state-run alternative? Even if it was unpalatable, it nonetheless showed that some sort of alternative to traditional sort of capitalism was possible. So that might be one of the reasons why you had this coincidence of dropping Keynesianism as the Soviet Union sort of imploded. And future of Keynesianism, just to sum up, I think Peter's right in the sense of the reindustrialization of what considered as the advanced capitalist countries, or the old capitalist countries, which are largely deindustrialized. Yeah, I think the question of profitability comes in. I mean, the idea that Trumpery or the military Keynesianism that the European leaders are going on about now is a non-starter. One, because it just isn't profitable to, even if tariffs were successful, to rebuild American motor industry, because what you'd have to also to rebuild at the same time, the steel industry and all the rest of it. And military Keynesianism, I mean, military production these days only employs a small number of people, and I don't think you're going to see the huge factories that were set up in the March II war and during the war, Second World War. That side of capitalism's gone. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Paul. Peter, do you want to reply straight away?
You
don't have to if you got nothing.
No, it's okay. Yeah, no, I think you're right. Conditions changed. The Cold War. I don't think I think the capitalist class, the elite, never had any real illusions that in Stalinism. I don't think the labor establishments really had any illusions in Stalinism as some sort of beacon of hope in socialist planning in the 30s even. It was just the planning, the administration. It was ideological, to that extent, that they could look at the kind of inverse fortunes of the West and the East, and say, look, the West is crumbling. Capitalism can't get out of its mess. It's plummeting. Industrial production is plummeting. Unemployment. There's a polar opposition between surplus capital and the surplus labor in terms of unemployment. So yeah, I don't necessarily think, and you're right. So, but it's really no big deal to me that in the 50s era, that Soviet Union was seen as like the really bad boys in the East kind of thing. You were always thought that way anyway. I think it is like a good question, that Paul, about I mean, your other points were good, but this issue of like the confluence between the end of social democracy and the fall of the Soviet Union. The end of the social democracy, if you look at social democracy, it more or less began to implode as soon as it developed. In the 60s, we had the commitment to how the NHS was supposed to run was kind of like reneged on. There was all sorts of services taken out of the NHS. The commitment to kind of prices and incomes policy always favoured profits and not wages. Then there was strikes. which looked at how things were being run poorly in the nationalized industries, and workers were losing in terms of pay and conditions. And so, and also capital began to kind of like use the euro dollar to become more mobile and bypass investing in British capital. So that was always on the go, and it intensified. And so you had a kind of like situation in the 70s, long before the Russia imploded, where social democracy was in question. And with Thatcher, you had this kind of like the think tanks around Thatcher, which were pursuing neoliberal agendas then. And when she took power in '79, then that was took a long time to crush social democracy through deindustrialization, attacking trade unions, and all the rest of it. But it was on the way out then, before the trade union, while the Soviet Union was still in existence. But by then, the Soviet Union, I think everyone knew in the West, the secret was out about the Soviet Union, that it wasn't kind of like raising the force of reduction. It wasn't at the forefront of like the developments of like planning and human progress. In fact, it was a poorly organized system which wasted resources and was just extensively grown and couldn't kind of grow in a more qualitative way. And it was on its own course to a demise itself. So there was a kind of like a rough parallel between them, but certainly a crossover. But and I suppose some of that crossover was, workers hanging on. I think lots of workers hanging on to this idea that there was somewhere else in the world that wasn't capitalist, that didn't exploit their workers, and that had a big effect for a long time.
Mm.
And when that wasn't there, maybe neoliberalism took even more hold, took further hold, and workers become politically atomized even more, as capital restructured to materially atomize workers, not just ideologically. Okay.
Thanks for that. Rafael, please.
Hello. Thank you for the interesting lecture, first of all. Secondly, on the question of the auspicious for capital confluence of the decline of social democracy in the fall of the Soviet Union, I would agree. I would say it is more coincidental. I agree with Peter that we see the decline of the post-war Keynesian settlement pretty much as soon as it comes into play. I mean, obviously in the 70s you have the sort of neoliberal wave. You have stagflation. In America, even the 60s. I would place sort of the decline of the Keynesian consensus in America in the 60s under the Kennedy administration. I think that really it's just the profitability required endlessly chipping away at these post-war guardrails on capitalism, and the concessions made to the working class at a moment of a degree of crisis, the need to recover from the war, that were just being endlessly chipped away at. I think that the fall of the Soviet Union instead really permitted this collapse of social democracy to have far less severe consequences immediately, at least to delay the consequences, the negative consequences, the destabilization that the decline of social democracy would have had on Western countries, by providing these vast new markets, the opening of China first, then the collapse of the Soviet Union, the vast privatization, just endless plunder for Western capital in the East, and in the creation of the world market, which allowed for this sort of 90s liberal triumphalism and end of history feeling. Secondly, on the question of the revival of Keynesianism, specifically in China, I definitely agree that is the Chinese state has been experimenting quite effectively with Keynesianism. I think in terms of constructing a welfare state in China, I think what we are quite likely to see is that it will be concomitant with the development of and growth of Chinese imperialism. I think that the dividends of imperialism through the Belt and Road Initiative and so on will, when they flow into China, will permit perhaps the realization of this sort of Chinese dream and this entire conception of the Xi Jinping administration as the sort of ideological mode of the mature capitalist bourgeois state in China. And finally, as a question, I'd just like to pose a counterfactual that maybe you'll entertain, but I think it was sort of implicit in your presentation. If we imagine a world where the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact isn't signed, or the Soviet invasion of Finland does not proceed, what are the consequences of perhaps the Popular Front not being broken, of the Labour left's sort of Sovietophilia or Stalinophilia remaining a more prominent current in the Labour Party? Does that have any effect, do you think? Does Labour not join the national government, or is the Attlee administration different, or is it not the Attlee administration? Is it the Bevan administration? Well, what are the consequences, or do things ultimately just end up the same way? Thank you.
Thanks, Rafael. Do you want to answer that, Peter, or shall I take somebody else?
Yeah, it's a good question, that the Popular Front. If that, didn't happen in Finland, I don't know. It could have. It clearly would have affected the left and the way they saw perhaps the establishment of social democracy. I mean, whether that would have affected the war and in what way, we don't know, but assuming that everyone comes out of the war, and I don't know, it's a tough question. I'd have to think about it more.
Matthew, please.
Thanks, Peter. I mean, in terms of that question, I really don't think it's likely, because obviously the US is so anti-communist, and Britain, of course, signs up to that. So I think that's not in the possibility. And I think the thing about Stalinism, of course, is that its actual role, in the world is, to actually stabilize capitalism and to kill revolutionaries, both of which it's been very good at. And I mean, if you look at the situation, I mean, the whole position in terms of the Second World War. I mean, first of all, okay, Stalin actually beheads the Red Army. Tukhachevsky, of course, is far too close to Trotsky, and therefore virtually much of the general staff of the Red Army is wiped out. Hence, the Germans are capable of running Operation Barbarossa. You then have, obviously, the signing of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which is so bad that Stalin actually and the NKVD actually hand over German communists to the Gestapo, and that's how bad they are, And at that point, of course, the Communist Party in Britain, of course, is against the war because it doesn't involve the Soviet Union, and obviously that's their masters. I mean, if you look at then once the Soviet Union is invaded, of course, there's nobody keener on the war than the CPGB. And in fact, of course, I mean, what happens in British terms, in terms of the base of the CPGB in the working class, of course, is it participates, the unions, and particularly this Communist Party, participate in the production committees and the maintaining of production at all costs, and the effort, of course, to suppress any form of strike action, basically run everything into the floor. I have to understand also, of course, I mean, at the time, I mean, Britain is in a terrible state. I mean, British production in the middle of the war, by 1943, British production actually starts to fall because obviously, its capital stock is essentially worn out. Obviously, from the 30s and previous, and of course the fact that the British are still skint, effectively skint after the First World War. So in those terms, obviously, then you have the situation. The situation becomes that the British then consciously and openly hand over as hegemon to the US and say, I actually pledge allegiance in the most fawning terms to the US. That's the point. That is why, obviously, there would be no question about agreeing any deal with the Stalinists, because obviously the British ever since have followed the notion, have followed the US. Completely and slavishly so, almost, and certainly on a foreign policy basis for most of the period, with odd exceptions. What you then see, of course, is that the resistance and strikes there are in the Second World War, which of course is a great deal fewer than there are in the First World War. It actually takes place against the Communist Party and actually with other forces, particularly obviously anarchists and most of all the Trotskyists. What you see after the Second War, or at the end of the war, of course, is then the Stalinists actually perform that role of restabilizing capitalism, preventing revolutions in France and Italy, which were quite possible and should have taken place. In the countries they take over in Central Eastern Europe, they actually re-establish capitalism. I mean, in the likes of Yugoslavia, they had to import capitalist politicians because they'd all fled, so they could form a government with them. And that happens throughout the whole area. And it's only when you have the Marshall Plan comes in, then the Stalinists decide that they're going to change the nature of the society towards the deformed worker state. That is the basis of it. And you see, obviously, in terms of the social democracy here, I mean, obviously the Attlee government, of course, is deeply against the organised working class. Attlee hates the idea of workers going on strike. It has a secret committee to tax striking workers. It's quite happy to employ the army's scabs on a number of strikes. So in those terms, and obviously the whole thing, nationalisation is done because exactly the system. One, they have to concede, but two, of course, the actual basis of the system is knackered. The actual capital base of the system is knackered. They have to refresh it. It's dead. As I say, after the war. So in those terms, I mean, the actual upsurge of militancy in the British working class starts really in the late 50s and through into the 60s. And the Communist Party always is at the back of that and attempting to stop it. This is obviously the militancy comes despite the Communist Party, not because of it. So in those terms, I mean, it's quite different. The other thing, of course, that happens is in the US itself is then McCarthyism as a means of wiping out an effort to wipe out and remove the left from the organised working class and more generally as a witch hunt against the left of all sorts. And that does, of course, enormous damage, and we're still suffering in terms of the nature of organisation and politics of the working class in the US as the chief opponent of the imperial hegemon. It's only we're beginning to see some things, but it's still stunted precisely because of McCarthyism. So in those terms, a critical period. Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. Do you want to say anything, Peter, or should I take some other comments?
No, that was good. I enjoyed that, Matthew, and I agree with what you say. And yeah, it was a good point that you raised about situating that counterfactual argument in Britain's kind of like international position with the US. Yeah.
Ian, please.
Good evening, comrades. Thank you. I wanted to ask two things. I just wanted to stress a couple of things. One is about the question of quality and its relationship to planning. And the other one is really, I'll start with that. So when I joined the YCL in 1974, I remember sort of reading Soviet Weekly and that kind of stuff. And of course, you got the impression that everything was going onwards and upwards in the Soviet Union. It was a fabulous place to live. And of course, even if you looked at Western Sovietologists they would be talking about how fantastic the Soviet Union, isn't it amazing that they've brought so much land under cultivation and they're producing this, that, or the other. And that stood in stark contrast with the Moskvich, a Soviet car imported into Britain, which was clearly rubbish. It stood in stark contrast with things like um, they were marketed in Britain as the Cossack, actually the Ural motorcycle. Absolute rubbish, really unreliable, really poor quality. Almost everything that you saw coming out of the Soviet Union was really dreadful quality. And the other aspect of it, and even if you took East Germany, which was in some way was a bit better, the MZ motorbike was a sort of, yeah, it was all right, not a bad winter bike. But generally, quality is very poor. Innovation was quite poor, and it was kind of replicated as well when in the sort of post-war period with lots of nationalised industries. Who can forget the Austin Allegro or whatever else? So quality and planning, but of course, this isn't real planning. This is the kind of bureaucratic administration which is passed off as planning, and that's the crucial difference. But I think it still exerts an influence even today. People's experience of state-run enterprises is that they're generally pretty dreadful. I mean, and that even extends to the National Health Service. I mean, I would defend the idea of free healthcare with my life, but the NHS itself, of course, was never anything even remotely socialized. I mean, the only thing that it has going for it that would be recognizable to any Marxist would be the idea of distribution according to need. You have the healthcare that you need. Aside from that, the quality is variable. It's no worse, incidentally, than what you get in the United States, where you get, for example, excellent quality if you're paying high premiums for your health insurance. And there are kind of distorting factors, such as the fact that you end up having tests for everything, that even if they're unnecessary. So drawing out this relationship between what would real planning be like and how would it assure quality is I think a challenge for Marxists. My own feeling is that with real planning, and therefore a real kind of participative democracy on the part of workers, then it's possible to address that. Unless you've got the market, you have to have real planning. That thing in the middle, it's not even in the middle, this kind of notion of a bureaucratic administration always seems to produce a dreadful quality. Anyone who's like me grew up in a council flat with dodgy building and all the rest of it can attest to it. So there's that thing, and I put that out there because of what I sometimes see on Facebook and elsewhere is a kind of nostalgia for the Soviet Union, and I don't begin to understand that. I mean, when I first went to the Soviet Union, I was absolutely shocked at just how dreadful it was as a place to live. There were certain things that seemed to work reasonably well, and I couldn't understand the contradiction between, on the one hand, the Moscow metro was absolutely superb, and then it occurred to me that it was always running at just on the edge of if a train ever did break down or something like that, it was chaos. The place would grind to a halt. It was because people were so dependent on it, and of course. It was only built in the first place because huge amounts of forced labour. So there's that aspect of it. So I don't begin to understand the nostalgia for the USSR, the nostalgia for the DDR, and so on. Even things like the war, World War II. People sort of get dewy-eyed when they talk about Marshal Zhukov or whatever else. Of course, it has to be remembered that the Soviet Union was delivering fuel to the Wehrmacht in the weeks before Operation Barbarossa. Arguably, Hitler could never have come to power in the first place without Stalin's help. It's not doesn't take the form of a direct assistance, but first of all, you've got established an authoritarian form of socialism, which the Nazis can then trade upon, and then you've got the fact that there was some real material assistance between the Soviet Union and Germany. Of course, it tailed off a bit when Hitler took power, but was gradually resumed. So, and then, of course, the absolutely disastrous nature of Stalin's leadership during the war, which led to many more millions of deaths than were absolutely necessary. So, and then we come on to things like the Attlee government, which people get very dewy-eyed over as well, ignoring the fact that, for example, the Attlee government set the scene for the beginning of the Vietnam War. It was under Attlee that the Japanese army was rearmed in order to reimpose French colonial rule in Indochina, and thereby set the scene for the whole of the next 30 years of horrible conflict. And so that sort of alliance between Stalinism and social democracy is almost two sides of the same coin, is an intriguing feature, and it's odd because even today people are still nostalgic for Keynesianism and nostalgic for Stalinism in a way that I find incomprehensible. Living in the Soviet Union, having been in a Soviet hospital, which was a awful kind of bloody experience, was enough to put you off it for life. So just that, really. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Anything you want to reply?
Yeah, I think just in terms of human alienation, in both systems, planning in the West, social democratic, the welfare state, nationalized industries, hospitals, and all the rest, and what went on in the Soviet Union, that kind of planning, then it was based on alien labor power. And if you don't, you either leave it to the market, which is, as Marx explained, it works the way it does behind people's backs, or you begin to think about how to coordinate resources and the use of your own human labor power in relation to their social needs, not just for yourself, but outside yourself as a social being, and in relation to the natural world again, because you're part of that natural world yourself. And so alienated people, alienated labor, don't get on well in planning, because it leads to bureaucracy, because they have to be told what to do, because they haven't got control themselves. They feel that they're still alienating their labor power and not able to direct it in the way that they want, which would empower them. They feel disempowered. So you have to have a layer of bureaucracy growing up to make the decisions, the rational decision, and cut back, and then a layer of management to carry that out. And on top of that, planning in the West and in social democracy, and even now, or rather public sector provision, is constrained from the outside by capital in the form of budget constraints. And those budget constraints create false scarcity of money between the different departments in the health service and education, in the welfare state and the provision of services, which get people to compete with each other over the money, the allocation of money, and that leads to a tax on labour. So, the more we look into that, the more we, as you rightly pointed out, Ian, the more we can see that unless, well, for one thing, we have to begin to unpick the very idea and deconstruct the notion that it's planning itself, and not just kind of some authoritarian way of controlling labour to produce a particular product or service under conditions which it has no power over, the working class has no power over, and the only power is to, is to go on strike, is to work more slowly, is to break the rules, and that kind of thing. So, yeah, whether that's West or East, that would be the case. Democratic planning, it simply means a more humane form of planning, which people have to make decisions on, about what to produce, when to produce, and how it's to be produced, and with what consequences. And that's the essence of democracy, as far as I can see. And that will be, that'll be the only way forward outside of the market. Yeah. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Yeah, good points though.
Thank you. Ant, please.
Hello. Sorry, things are appearing on my screen. I think to this day, Stalinism is widely equated with communism. But it's not simply a case of Stalinism. I think also the partial critique of Stalinism, which ends up reproducing many of its features. And I'm talking in terms of Trotskyism and also certain aspects of social democracy, the so-called left wing, and even organisations which claim to be neither Stalinist nor Trotskyist, and end up to possibly not completely directly, but at least indirectly supporting some of the main tenets of Stalinism. And I'm thinking in terms of I think Tina pulled me up for this last week. I'm thinking in terms of the CPGB, which, as far as I know, at least into the 2020s, was talking, or at least some of them were talking about the USSR being an example of bureaucratic socialism. So that to me is not saying that Stalinism was neither capitalist nor socialist. That to me is saying that Stalinism was socialism. So just sticking the word bureaucratic in front of it does not mean that it does not lessen the impact of describing Stalinism as socialism. However, what I'm trying to say is that many of the fundamentals of Stalinism remain in place and are not really criticized by those bodies which claim to be non-Stalinist. So, for example, the ideas of fronts, either the Popular Front or the United Front, whereby the working class is expected to tie its interest to some bourgeois outfit, often in the name of some sort of illusory, an illusion of anti-fascism, or for whatever other reason. And I think also we can talk about the anti-imperialism, which is understood as something other than the proletarian revolution. So apparently under this umbrella, we get the ideas of a national liberation, whereby certain areas of the world can apparently exist outside of imperialism, which I think is completely untrue. All the anti-imperialism and all the national liberation, anti-imperialism boils down to is that the weaker nations can effectively leave one imperialist bloc and join another. That's all that's on offer. But no, there's no national liberation under imperialism. There's no way outside of the imperialist nexus. The only but I think all of this comes down to a very, very, well, really a simple conclusion. There are no national solutions anymore. There are no capitalist solutions anymore. Under capitalism, all the working class can expect is a worsening of its situation. The only alternative that the working class has to this inexorable worsening is to make the world revolution. And failure to make the world revolution will inevitably lead to the the outbreak of yet another round of World War. So I think that that is the legacy of Stalinism, if you like. It still remains. It remains in the illusions that there is some other set of tactics or ways out or possibilities which are something other than the class war and the world revolution. And I would also like to say that I think another widespread legacy or result of Stalinism is the idea that the working class can be represented by some sort of a minority. Now, I've heard, I've listened to a few of these, Zoom meetings, and we get this idea of this. We need a mass party, and I think, okay, we need a substantial, significant, well-rooted party. I can accept that. But then some people are talking about a party of millions of people. I'm not sure, how you perceive this. Do you think that this party of millions of people then becomes some sort of a ruling organ? Yes, because I think myself that that is precisely not how it works. I think that the proletariat creates its own self-organization. It's not represented by any minority, even if it's a minority of several millions within a party. The party does not rule. The party does not take power. And I think that is one mighty legacy of Stalinism, which remains embedded in the mentality of many people. That the socialism is or the path to socialism lies to a communist party taking power. That is not the case. The Communist Party is not a government in waiting. The organs of power are the workers' own self-created organizations. Now, we can't say exactly what they will be in the future. So it's not simply a case of, well, let's see what they created in 1917 and reproduce that. Or let's see what the German proletariat created in 1919 or 1923 or whatever other date that you want to pull up from history. We cannot say exactly what the proletarian self-organization of the future will be, but that is what will be the vehicle for socialism. That is what will rule, not any party, not a party of hundreds or thousands or even millions. It will be the working class itself. Okay, thank you very much.
Slightly off topic. Thanks. Peter, would you like to sum up or reply to maybe a last comment? If you want to, you don't have to, but it was slightly off topic.
Yeah.
We have no more questions now from the floor, so you can use this to sum up. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Ant's made some useful comments, and it's this thing about a party. I don't particularly like seeing a party as like different from the working class, but then represent form of government to lead them by the nose, that kind of thing. That's not a communist party for me. But if we have a mass communist party, then don't we include the working class as part of that mass? And won't they you're right. If we have a mass communist party and there's lots of workers inside, for me, they will determine how a revolution might occur and what organizational forms will take place. But a party in that sense is a kind of collective where they can express and share their ideas, and shouldn't be seen as like some sort of cadre of middle-class do-gooders, waiting for the convenient time when they can lead workers by the nose. So, because we need some sort of way of bringing our ideas, sharing our experiences together, so as workers, and call that a party, call it what you like, but we need it. And on the basis of that, when the circumstances are right and we don't choose them, then working class people will be able to share the ideas and the experiences that they've had, and that memory, and and form the right kind of response to the to the situation, which could make for a successful revolution. But if we just say that, you know, workers spontaneously, and I'm not saying that you're saying this, but because you haven't come up with another kind of party, if you're saying, or if anyone kind of thinks that spontaneously workers will suddenly find a particular way of doing things that will defeat a capitalist class that is organized politically, then I don't think that will lead to revolution. I think that will lead to a kind of like, you know, a lot of bloodshed and possibly definitely counter-revolution, which could put back the cause of the working class even further. So we have to grasp, in other words, the nettle of the dialectic of a working class party and the working class. And the only way I can see is that the party must be the working class.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, comrade. A slightly earlier finish than usual, but that's not a bad thing. Please note that we had a slight change in next week's session. So we've got a Communist Culture Club next week, where we have we're looking at Henry Grossman and his ideas around the end of capitalism, which are presented by author Ted Rees. It's a really good book. I urge comrades to buy it beforehand if you can. It's available everywhere. So that's on Henrik Grossman. So looking forward to that. Thanks very much, Peter. Interesting opening, interesting discussion, everybody. We will be taking some of these debates also to this year's Communist University, which is taking place in central London, and where most of the speakers who've been in this session will be speaking there, and you can meet them all in person, and it'd be great to see some comrades there. So look it up, and hopefully we'll see you next week here. Thank you, Peter. Thanks, comrades. Bye-bye.